All right, guys, I just wanted to go conference by conference over the official college football playoff picture here while it is still fresh on my mind here. After week number 10, we got a big shakeup with Alabama officially out of the playoff mix and possibly maybe even LSU entering it with 2 losses. So I'm going to go conference by conference. Talk about the teams. Does the conference have a chance to get 1, maybe 2 teams in the playoff? Let's start with the ACC, and obviously, guys, we got the crazy game last night between Clemson and Notre Dame, with Notre Dame annihilating Clemson at home. Clemson, to me, is I would say they need a miracle. They are, I believe, undefeated right now in their conference. They've already wrapped up their division, the Atlantic, so they are headed to their conference championship game, probably or very likely facing North Carolina, who also is 8-1. But at this point, would a 1-loss ACC champ Clemson get in over Tennessee? Who, if Tennessee finishes with 1 loss, I don't think so. I would have to look at their resume at the end of the season. There's a lot working against Clemson right now. That's not just their loss to Notre Dame. It's also, the big win that they had over Syracuse being basically meaningless. They also have a game against Louisville, who Louisville is looking very good, guys. They're moving up. They're a top 25 team right now, according to FPI. And the other main issue is Clemson's quarterback situation. Their offense seems broken. So it looks like the ACC championship will be Clemson against North Carolina. North Carolina has 2 more tough games, including a road game at Wake Forest. So if I was a betting person, I think Clemson goes to the ACC championship with 1 loss and a hope and a prayer at making the playoff. And I think North Carolina enters the ACC championship game with 2 losses because they've got a tough road game at Wake Forest, and then they have a home game, I believe, versus NC State. So they've got 2 hard games. Other than that, that's pretty much it. When it comes to the New Year 6 representative, it's probably going to be decided between Clemson and North Carolina. Whoever wins that conference championship will go. Does a 1-loss North Carolina have any chance at the playoff? I would say no. They're simply too far down. It is pretty remarkable with North Carolina not even being a top 25 team according to FPI. It's due to their horrible defense. It's going to really bring them down. The metrics do not like them. Moving on to the Big 12, so we saw more parity within the Big 12. The Big 12 has 1 chance currently at the playoff, and in my opinion, that is an undefeated TCU. Could we see a scenario where TCU loses this week on the road to Texas, but still, finishes with 1 loss, wins the Big 12, and then makes the playoff? I think it's far-fetched. There's too many teams. You've got 2 Big 10 teams. You've got 2 SEC teams. That would surprise me. I do think TCU at this point needs to finish undefeated. They will be underdogs on the road. That's the big 7:30 ABC game. And then TCU, after facing Texas on the road, has Baylor on the road, who certainly, after their big win against Oklahoma, should be a top 25 team. So I'm guessing TCU will be dropping one of those games, which will likely knock the Big 12 out of the playoffs, in my opinion. But we know the name of the game with TCU. If they go undefeated, they're in. There's no worries, especially with Alabama being officially eliminated. If they lose a single game, they're very likely out. There is a small chance they could lose to Texas and then win out and get in, but you would need several other things to happen, and at that point, they would be probably pitted against a 1-loss Clemson for a better resume, maybe a 1-loss Michigan, and I think Michigan probably gets in over them, even with their horrible non-conference schedule. Speaking of Michigan, moving on to the Big Ten, you've got Ohio State. They were the number 1 team according to FPI. They've dropped down a spot after their performance against Northwestern. It is important to note the FPI does not take into account weather. They just see that Ohio State struggled to throw the ball. They don't have the nuance because they're a computer system to understand that it was the weather. I'm not resolving Ohio State of their bad performance. It was a terrible performance. Ohio State has huge issues running the ball. They have a horrible run-blocking offensive line. I understand that, but I am saying the context there, the FPI is thinking Ohio State's pass offense is struggling against a horrible Northwestern defense, when really, if it's a sunny day, Ohio State is winning that game 52-7. And obviously it's hiding their deficiencies, but let's be real. So Ohio State, the Big Ten, there's really two situations. Obviously, we're expecting the winner of the Ohio State-Michigan game to beat whoever the representative is out of the West, be undefeated, and be ranked second, probably behind Georgia, in the playoff. It gets really interesting. If Ohio State loses to Michigan at home, they obviously will finish with one loss. They will not make the Big Ten championship. They would still have a chance. And the redeeming quality with Ohio State possibly losing to Michigan, the redeeming quality is their win against Penn State and their win against Notre Dame. Guys, Notre Dame right now is doing wonders for Ohio State. Because and the thing is, Notre Dame's going to be a top 25 team, and they face USC at the end of the season. Now, USC is going to be favorites in that game, but it will be, imagine if Notre Dame beats USC, possibly moves inside the top 15. Ohio State has 2 wins against 2 top 15 teams. Even with the loss to Michigan and not making the Big Ten championship, they would at least have an argument against Tennessee. It gets a little more tough for Michigan due to their horrible non-conference schedule. And by horrible, I mean we're talking about Baylor 2014 levels. It is a very, very horrific. We're talking about 3 of the top 10 worst teams in FBS according to FPI. That's who Michigan's non-conference schedule was. You've got Hawaii, you've got Colorado State, and UConn. So for Michigan, if they lose on a walk-off field goal in Columbus, they're going to have a case, but that's where the non-conference schedule comes into play. They can still make it, but it gets a lot more difficult. Michigan should have just scheduled a mediocre Power 5 team. The committee really wants to discourage the type of scheduling that Michigan did this year in their non-conference. We remember back in 2014, Baylor had a horrible non-conference. They end up with 1 loss. They are out of the playoff. That was more of a TCU thing. It was TCU versus Ohio State, but still, Baylor's non-conference was a major sticking point for the committee. And nobody's saying to schedule 3, no one's saying to go out there and schedule Alabama, LSU, and Texas in your non-conference, but you would like to have at least 1 Power 5 good team, and Michigan just does not have that. So that's where it becomes squirrely. If Michigan loses to Ohio State, they're a 1-loss team. The metrics probably say they're a minimum top 5 team, possibly even top 4, but will the committee have them inside the top 4? If TCU loses, you're talking about a 1-loss possible Big 12 champion TCU versus a 1-loss Michigan. Does the non-conference come into play? It is interesting. Another quick thing to note, you do have Penn State there, who is really solidifying themselves as a New Year's 6 team. They do have to win out, but they're looking really good right now to make a New Year's 6 bowl. And then you do have Minnesota at 6-3. I would say that Minnesota, I don't know how Minnesota's a top 20 team. They were losing to Nebraska late in the third quarter of that game, but Minnesota is top 20. Also, I think Wisconsin is a little bit better than people think. They're currently number 22 on FPI. They're not a top 25 team, but they're better than people think they are. The Big Ten West is a complete joke at this point with Illinois losing and moving down significantly. You can't lose to Michigan State. If I had to guess, anyone but Iowa out of the West. That's what I'm hoping. The last thing the Big Ten needs is Iowa back in Indianapolis and scoring 3 points with that offense. It's a national embarrassment. It really is. Moving to the Pac-12 and their current situation, Utah's a really good team. That week 1 loss, that's where the non-conference can bite you. On the road in humidity against a Florida team that's really not that good. That killed Utah. They're 7-2. They have no chance at the playoff. Oregon is getting increasingly more Something to watch here with Oregon. 8-1 right now. I would say they're definitely the Pac-12's best chance at having a playoff team. They've got the horrible week 1 loss, but they've since rebounded. They're beating everyone. They're impressive. Their metrics are improving every week. USC, I just don't think is good enough. I don't think their defensive roster is talented enough. UCLA, very similar, although they do have a really nice offense. So I think this comes down to Oregon. If they win out, it's one of those squirrely things where you get annihilated in week 1, but it was week 1. They have since rebounded and played better, and they're getting better every week, so we will see what happens with them. And then moving on to the SEC, you've got Georgia, very likely going to be the number 1 overall team. They're currently back in the FPI number 1 position. Alabama, funny enough, sitting at the number 3 spot. That is due to the 2 ridiculously close losses they had both on the road. The 3-point loss at Tennessee and the 1-point overtime loss to LSU just last night. They are not involved in the playoffs. LSU, unless they have a catastrophe, they would have to lose their last 2 SEC games to miss out on the SEC championship, because they have 1 loss within the SEC. Alabama has 2 losses within the SEC, and they have the tiebreaker over Alabama. So they would have to lose to both Arkansas, and then I don't know the other team that they face in conference, but it's 2 road games. Could you imagine a situation where LSU loses both those games, Alabama makes the SEC championship, and then they put Alabama in the playoff as a 2-loss team? I'm just making, it's just funny. But LSU, the narrative right now, if they win out, if they beat Georgia in the SEC championship, yes, they're going to make the playoff. Will it happen? 99% chance, no, it won't happen. The expectation is Georgia finishes undefeated. That the situation becomes Tennessee at 11-1, not making the SEC championship, their only loss on the road at Georgia. And by the way, that game actually turned out very favorably for Tennessee. Tennessee was completely outmatched in that game against Georgia. They should have gotten annihilated. They kept it respectable, 27-13, and that looks a little bit better for them. So guys, the bottom line when it comes to the playoff, if I had to make a prediction right now, I might go with 2 SEC teams and 2 Big Ten teams. I know that's not what people want to hear, but we could be looking at Georgia number 1, Ohio State number 2, Tennessee number 3, Michigan number 4. The sticking point is TCU, and if TCU loses a game, if TCU loses 2 games, obviously they're done. If they lose a game and then they win the Big 12, your argument comes down to a bunch of 1-loss teams. You have a 1-loss Tennessee team that doesn't make the SEC championship. You have a 1-loss Michigan team if Michigan loses to Ohio State, who has a horrible non-conference but probably top 4 metrics. And then you have a 1-loss TCU team who wins the Big 12, who has good wins, but who has horrible game control metrics and a really bad defense. And then possibly a 1-loss Oregon team, depending if they win the Pac-12, and their only loss was week 1, but it was a blowout, and they also do have really good wins. So it's an extremely murky, cloudy playoff situation after what happened yesterday. The only sure thing we can say, Georgia for sure, for certain is pretty much in. Ohio State, if they beat Michigan, is pretty much in. Michigan, if they beat Ohio State, is pretty much in. TCU, if they go undefeated, they're in, but that's unlikely considering their next 2 games. They're probably going to be both underdogs at Texas and at Baylor. I would be very surprised if they won both of those games. And then the other quick thing I wanted to say, the group of 5 representative, very likely coming from the American Conference once again. It comes down to UCF, Cincinnati, and Tulane. I still like UCF as long as they get their starting quarterback Plumlee back. I know he had a concussion. Tulane, I think, is a fraud. They should have lost to Tulsa. They were bailed out because Tulsa's starting quarterback didn't play at all in that game. They only scored 27 points. And Tulane, their next 2 games, or their next 3 games, UCF, SMU, who scores a ton, and Cincinnati. They're going to lose one of those games. I believe the representative will either be UCF or Cincinnati, which is kind of boring because I do like new blood. But either way, that's just what I think is going to happen when it comes to the Group of 5 representative. I don't see any other Group of 5 conference that can offer someone with, Toledo losing a few weeks ago. I thought there was a chance Toledo could finish 10-2, have an outside shot at it, but they have 3 losses now. You're not going to take a 3-loss MAC team, certainly. So that is where we currently stand when it comes to the college football playoff picture. And it is really murky right now. The ACC is on its deathbed, with Clemson still with 1 loss, but really no chance. They just don't have a good enough resume. You can't get crushed by Notre Dame, even though I think Notre Dame is a solid team. They're just not good enough, man. Clemson, in my opinion, I would probably rank them behind Penn State. I know Penn State has 3 losses, but if they play it on a neutral field, it's an extremely competitive game, and I'm probably taking Penn State. So Clemson needs a lot to happen. They would need Oregon. They would definitely need the Pac-12 to be out of it. They would need 2 losses for everyone in the Pac-12. They would need TCU. I mean, if you want to argue a 1-loss TCU versus a 1-loss Clemson, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel there. You're talking about, Tennessee and Michigan as 1-loss teams getting in over both of them, I would say. But the whole Michigan thing, the sticking point with them could be their horrible non-conference. It just depends. How do you lose to Ohio State if you lose? Then they start talking about the non-conference. And they're going to tear Michigan's non-conference apart. And that's a narrative that's going to develop if Michigan loses to Ohio State. So that is the official playoff picture update after week number 10, guys. A lot of stuff left to be decided. It really is just a giant cluster outside of Georgia. So we'll see what happens, guys. But that's going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description.